Good evening, Ontario Biodiversity Summit. My name's Ed Gillespie. I'm co-founder of Futerra Sustainability Communications, and it's an absolute honour and a privilege to be talking to you this evening. As we're talking about nature and business and biodiversity, we thought it's appropriate to do this outside. So I'm enjoying a grey, wet springtime morning here in London, and I'm hoping to talk to you about the relationship between business and biodiversity. So the title of my talk is Pricing Everything, Valuing Nothing. And what I want to explore is the relationship between business and biodiversity. Now, they can feel like two very different worlds. We tend to think of business as very competitive and cutthroat, and perhaps the web of nature and ecosystems and biodiversity as a little bit more collaborative. Equally, we can often think of our economy as about throughput and about flow of materials and resources, whereas we know that nature tends to be more interconnected and interdependent. But equally, both of these worlds embrace the kind of twin challenges of homeostasis, a degree of self-regulation, a degree of management of stability. But equally, they also both embrace creative disruption. When conditions change, when circumstances shift, we can see extraordinary transformations in both business and in nature. And that's the grist of what I'd like to explore this evening. When we think about the relationship between nature and business, we often feel that this relationship is going in the wrong direction. And much of this comes down to the illusion of separation. And this is both an optical and a cognitive delusion. The fact that we somehow consider ourselves separate from nature and apart from it. And when we have this disconnection, which is obviously exacerbated by our increasingly digital world, which divides us from the natural world, we can tend to become separate, and it allows us to exploit those resources in a utilitarian and instrumental way. You know, the web of life is not just resources, it's our family, it's our life support system, it's the very thing that keeps us going. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've basically focused on extractive industries, which have been going through our natural capital and our natural resources at a rate of knots. Now, this is problematic. It's like a corporate fire sale of our natural capital. Pavan Sukhdev, the author of The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, say, we use nature because it's valuable, but we lose it because it's free. And this has been a real challenge for us because we are tearing through this natural capital now at an extreme rate of knots. And we're doing a pretty good job. Many of us will have felt, actually in our hearts, the news from WWF recently that, you know, in the last 40 years we have basically destroyed 50% of our vertebrate biomass. And that's an extraordinary, challenging and difficult thing to emotionally understand and appreciate. And not only that, but that depletion comes from a shifting baseline. And many psychologists and fisheries biologists, ironically, which is my original background, talk about this as a fundamental problem because shifting baseline syndrome means we're already understanding the nature we experience from a very depleted level, i.e. the richness historically of biodiversity that would have been around is not something that we comprehend. We accept the denuded, degraded level that we see around us as normal. And that enables us to kind of forget that actually nature's fecundity and bounty should be much, much richer, much, much more diverse, much, much more plentiful. And this is an extraordinary thing when we start to think about it from a generational context, with each and every subsequent generation experiencing a more depleted nature than the one that came beforehand. And we're actually experiencing what Will Stephan calls the Great Acceleration, where our growth in population from 2.5 billion to 7 billion over the last 65 years since 1950 is creating extraordinary resource pressures and actually arguably developing an existential crisis for humanity. And the reason this is challenging and problematic and actually needs to kind of shift a lot of our thinking and our mindsets is we've turned the world around in a relatively short period of time. You know, we've come at the end of what we might call the Holocene, you know, the stable period of climatic stability that we've enjoyed for the last 10,000 years, during which modern agriculture and most of modern civilization has emerged. And we're actually now entering in the Anthropocene, where we are the major driving force of life on Earth, where we are assuming the awesome responsibility, hopefully in a humble fashion, for understanding that we will decide the fate of ourselves and the species with which we share this planet. Now, we need to appreciate that there are planetary boundaries. There are 9 principal planetary boundaries, and what Kate Raworth from Oxfam calls the safe and just donut for humanity, which is living within an environmental ceiling, but based upon strong social foundations. Now that's the space we need to aim for, and both business and society have huge responsibility in trying to achieve that transition to that safe and just space for humanity. And this is compounded by the fact that we're in the urbanising century. Over half of us now live in cities, and this creates a sense of the desert of the real, when we could be surrounded by apparent plenty and bounty and productivity, and yet fundamentally disconnected from those systems that sustain us. And equally, this becomes a challenge then for the next generation coming through, because those of us who experience less of nature will ironically care less about it. And so we're potentially bringing up generations of younger people who don't have the same passion and love of nature that perhaps those of us who've come beforehand have been happy enough and able enough to enjoy. And when we look at this in the context of our economy, we're still wrestling with this paradigm of infinite growth on a finite planet. You know, our economy has now reached the stage of $100 trillion turnover every year. That is not physically possible to sustain with the technologies that we currently use on the planet that we currently live on. Which begs the question that many economists might ask, ironically, in that, what has nature ever done for us? And we're responding to that with this idea of natural capital, you know, the idea of food, fisheries, fresh air, forests, pollination services, even the scenic landscapes, which are so important for tourism. All of these are diverse and vital forms of natural capital that we're starting to economise, we're starting to describe in financial and economic terms. And these resources are infinitely valuable. In fact, the 2014 State of Green Business Report calculated that if businesses, and they studied 4,500 of the world's largest companies, actually had to kind of factor in their environmental impact into their profitability, they would realise that their impact on the natural environment and on natural capital in particular would have wiped out all of their profits. In fact, it's worse than that. And if you actually had to kind of work out a financial figure and put it on this, our impact on our finite stock of natural capital is equivalent of $7.3 trillion cost to the global economy every year. Now we know it's even more significant because some of that loss is actually irreversible. So we're putting a price tag on things, but actually the impacts are really incalculable. In fact, nature is like an angel investor into the global economy, financially significant, but widely and publicly unknown and unappreciated. And two examples kind of illustrate this very starkly. If you take the value of the global pharmaceuticals industry, for example, that's $640 billion per year, at least half of which is attributable directly to the genetic diversity of wild species. Or let's look at mangroves in Thailand, where if we look at them for their value in terms of wood and harvesting of wood for firewood, then they're worth about $1,000 per hectare. But if you start to factor in their role in carbon capture and storage, in terms of flood mitigation or as fish breeding grounds, then quickly we see that their real value is $21,000 per hectare. So it's much, much, much bigger. And what we're essentially doing is failing to appreciate these much, much bigger, much more significant financial ecosystem services. And many are arguing actually that the language of business and nature can actually be interchangeable. And if we start to look at some of the business terminology about maximizing returns, investing in your assets, managing risks and opportunities and promoting innovation, all of these are business terms which can be usefully applied to our relationship with nature as well. But I'm worried in some senses that this starts to bring a slightly more sterile and stagnant, even stale language of business into actually the management of what should be a wonderful and sustainable and eternal resource. I think traditionally and historically we've looked at minimization of corporate footprints, the kind of good green housekeeping. But increasingly we have to do a lot more than that. We have to start to look at innovative business models, changing the relationship with nature, but equally about brain print, our cultural footprint. How do we actually change the way that other people interact with our businesses and the activities and the products and services we provide? And there are numerous benefits that businesses can gain from actually a more constructive type of engagement with biodiversity. That can start with reputation, but it also can change the credibility of a business by making big, ambitious and bold commitments. It can help manage risks in the supply chain, and it can engage customers and employees in a more loyal, meaningful sense around business purpose and actually what a business is there to achieve, which is obviously not just about liquidating natural capital for profit and commercial gain, but actually taking a much more responsible, integrated and beautiful approach. Sometimes these results can be quite surprising. The Dow Chemical Company, perhaps a business with a rather checkered past historically, has recently partnered with the Nature Conservancy Council in the US. When they were looking at a new wastewater treatment facility for one of their plants in Texas, they found that actually by rehabilitating and regenerating adjacent wetlands, they could actually achieve exactly the same environmental ends with a $200 million saving. So going for a natural capital solution was far better than a typically hard-engineered classic commercial and corporate one. And what's interesting about this is Dow is now committed to achieving $1 billion worth of similar savings. So sometimes nature's solutions and working with the grain of nature rather than against it can actually make really sound financial business sense as well. And there's 3 or 4 great examples from Futerra's own work which are demonstrating how businesses are also engaging with a real sense of purpose which is bigger than themselves. Many businesses are now trying to revisit their raison d'etre, their reason for existence. Why are they here? And unfortunately, without a purpose which is bigger than yourself, you're likely to serve only yourself. The first of these is Kingfisher, which owns one of the largest kind of DIY chains and several businesses across Europe. They came to us and they were exploring their own sustainability strategy. And 10 years ago, businesses used to come to us and say, what should our sustainability strategy be in the context of our business? Now they're increasingly asking at the cutting edge and the pioneering edge, is like, what should our business strategy be in the context of sustainability? And what Kingfisher did was actually were looking at their timber supply chain, and they were having real challenges looking at the sustainability and availability of timber at the right price in their global business. And the potential project they came up with was a project called Net Positive. And the idea is that they could become a restorative business. So they would actually be managing and increasing the amount of timber in the world in order to sustain both their own supply chain, but also to increase the benefits of biodiversity and people working within it. And so it's that idea of actually leaving the world in a better place than that which you found it. The second one would be our work with the Forest Stewardship Council. Now, everyone is very familiar with the FSC logo as a certification of trying to look at sustainable management of forestry for both people and planet. Now, where this becomes interesting is, whilst the FSC logo is very well recognised, it perhaps doesn't have the emotional and functional benefit to customers. So many of FSC's clients were actually saying, whilst we are making the additional cost investment in order to have FSC certification, we're not seeing the same customer loyalty and benefit that we might. So what we've done is try to create a really stirring emotional connection for the FSC with their customer. And this is all around the idea of forests for all, forever. And it's a very beautiful type of engagement. And the idea is that this will give people additional meaning when they are making that FSC purchase. So to know that they are actually having a tangible, real, physical impact on the benefits and the prospects for global forestry. And the third one would be an example that we've done with one of the largest conservation bodies in the UK, the Wildlife Trusts. This is a federated organisation which has sites and conservation sites all over the UK. And what we wanted to do for the Wildlife Trust was actually create a very strong personal and local and meaningful connection with conservation areas and local people. And the notion here is the idea of my wildlife, something which is bespoke and customised and relevant to people in their own area. So people can experience and understand and appreciate nature and biodiversity for their own personal reasons and have a specific understanding of what the benefits of that might be. And also to excite people and to make it adaptable and relevant in all different contexts. And the final one is where we're working with Caring and Puma, and we're looking at their environmental profit and loss, and we're trying to make this a very engaging way of looking at the full holistic 360-degree impact of a business on its natural capital and on the wider world. And this is extraordinarily useful because this is now generating real insights for the business about how to manage their impacts in a more intelligent and effective way. And that helps with this decision making, which can often be mired in complexity and complicated aspects. So it goes beyond the numbers. It's actually looking at what impact that business is having and how it can change and mitigate that in the future. And again, whilst all of this focus on business and engagement with biodiversity and the management of natural capital is useful, and personally, I look forward to a day when crunching the numbers saves the planet rather than crunching the planet saves the numbers. I still think we are missing out on something really important, which is about our reconnection with nature, actually managing nature and engaging with nature for people and not protecting it from people. And I think that's quite an important shift. And we need to think about the different ways that people appreciate and love nature. And that's part of our journey of rediscovery. And that journey of rediscovery is about reconnection. It's about enjoyment of nature. It's about empathy for other creatures. It's about a sense of oneness. It's about a sense of responsibility. It's about reconnection with that which is most fundamental in life, about reconnection with each other, about reconnection across the generations, and about a reconnection with ourselves, because we are nature. So I think we need to feel nature again, not just treat it as this abstract, optional, external thing. It needs to be based on these ideas of awe and wonder and emotion and love. And in that sense, we need to actually get people back out into nature. We know how disarming it can be to immerse people back in the beauty of biodiversity. And this can be extraordinarily powerful. There is this idea that we are so insulated and disconnected, but actually nature can break those barriers down very quickly. One of the great thinkers in this space always talks about this as the fact that our culture is only 3 days deep. And actually taking us out into nature for 3 days can completely transform our thinking, remove that insulating layer and actually get us to see the world for how it really is and how it really functions. And it's time to bring our ecological crisis and our emerging consciousness together. I talk about this as an extraordinary emergency requiring an extraordinary emergence. It's time for us to try and define a sense of planetary purpose. Human beings became planetary 40,000 years ago as we migrated onto every continent on the planet. And we now need to have a sense of collective responsibility about how we manage and engage with our natural resources and each other in a way which is integrated, intelligent and effective. And this sense of planetary purpose could be incredibly powerful and transformative. And perhaps the biggest flip we have to make is to realise and appreciate the fundamental truth that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of ecology. We need to understand that we are trying to craft a new story. We need to invert the narrative that we've enjoyed and exploited for the last few generations and actually redefine a more compelling narrative which is about us within and as an integral part of a happy and contented nature and natural world. So it's not just about the numbers, it's not just about natural capital. Whilst these tools might be useful, I do fear that we may be engaging in an era where we're understanding the price of everything and the real, intrinsic, beautiful value of nothing. And so there's a note of caution to be struck at the end here, but also a note of optimism. Because if we can reconnect, if we can celebrate our interdependence, then this new narrative can be one which inspires change and transformation around the world. A story of us as nature, beautiful, irreplaceable, priceless. It's a story which can reconnect us. It's a story of interdependence. It's a magical story, and it's a love story, and it's potentially the most compelling, inspiring story we might ever tell.